Hello and welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. In today's review we're going to be catching up on one of the last releases from 2022 because I've been away for quite a while and naturally when you blink for 5 seconds 15 billion Big Finish box sets are released, but rather excitingly in today's review I'm going to be taking a look at the 8th volume of the infamous, brilliant, masterful The War Master series. This box set in particular is entitled Escape from Reality and features 4 stories based in the land of fiction. This box set is available to order now on the Big Finish website in both physical CD and digital download formats, as well as being able to be purchased as a part of a bundle alongside the other War Master releases. Can we firstly start off this review by giving credit to Sean Longmore, who has created quite possibly one of the best Big Finish cover arts of all time. Utterly beautiful, stylish, and really sells the bizarre nature of this series. We are technically now at the very end of the second run of the War Master spin-off series, yet this series still continues to feel like an event, with each and every release doing something different. This series is no exception, being rather bold, seeing the Master venture into the land of fiction from the second Doctor story, The Mind Robber. Rashana Patel opens the series with Wrath of Medusa, which really ups the stakes for this series concept. I'll admit I went into this story with a bit of a low expectation, and I will say now this is 100% down to personal taste. When we learnt about Greek mythology in school, it was always done in such a dull way, so now when I approach a story that has such themes, I'm a little bit hesitant to say the least. What I love about this story is Sir Derek Jacobi, but that is no surprise if you've been listening to previous reviews. But in particular, I love the fact that we get to see the Master amongst gods, so for once he is not the most powerful person in the room. His usual threats don't have the same impact, but that doesn't stop him being brilliantly dark. We get to see him essentially team up with Perseus and Athena from mythology, and we meet several gods along the way, including a great final act with Medusa herself. The story takes the form of a mission to overcome the godly powers within the realm. Despite the fact that we are in a completely different realm, I love how Rashana still manages to blend the themes of the Time War and the Master's role within such war into the narrative itself. He has his own aims to essentially build a weapon and weapons test within the land of fiction to cause as much chaos as possible. In a world of different rules, I think this story effectively displays how the Master can use this place as his own personal toy box of destruction. It's a really visual story too. Medusa is represented superbly by Ella Smith, and at parts I did actually feel sorry for her. I certainly connected with the story's characters a lot more than I thought I would, so if you're like me, say uncertain or hesitant with the story's theme, then I definitely recommend going into this episode with an open mind as much as possible. For an opening story, I really think these fictional creations come alive. I'm certainly intrigued over how this story sets up the rest of the series. It definitely ups the stakes. Lizzie Hopley writes the second episode of this set entitled The Shadow Master, and what an episode this is. Firstly, I'd like to share some appreciation for Robert Harvey, who has composed the music for the entirety of this set, but also for this episode in particular. The score is absolutely incredible. It's so suited to the narrative style, emotional and beautifully crafted. The entirety of this episode is really impressive and boasts how grand the audio drama format can feel, despite not being visual. The music for this story is presented at the very end of the download or the physical CD for this story, which I was really grateful for as it's an absolute work of art. Unusually, the focus of this episode is the Shadow rather than the War Master, and it works so well. For the most part, this story reminds me of those unusual episodes you tend to get within Netflix series that shift their focus onto another character for one story in particular, with the main character being off to the side but is still somewhat involved. Gethin Anthony is incredibly talented, being responsible for essentially telling the listener the story in an audiobook style, which I know may put some people off, but I really think in the context of this episode, it is an effective way to deliver the story. The listener gets drawn into the Shadow's life. You get to know the character in a really personal way. The relationship he has with the character of Poetry is also beautifully romantic. It's so heartwarming and fuzzy, which feels so weird saying that given that this is a War Master story, which usually tends to be quite dark, grim and deep. Perhaps that's why it works so well, because it's that stark contrast. You go expecting one thing and then you come out of the other side having experienced something completely different. Or have you? Who knows? Yes, it is a little bit of a cliche given one of the characters' names, but this story is really poetic. Again, very much like episode 1, it does feel very visual in its design. It's a very intimate listening experience. Aside from perhaps the start of the story feeling a little bit slow, I think beyond the 15-minute mark it really starts to come together. I did, however, have a bit of concern at the very beginning, where things weren't quite falling into place for me personally. I think in particular it was getting used to the way that the story was being told. Once you've kind of got the hang of that, then it runs quite well. It does feel very fairy tale and will certainly stick within the mind. It also really intrigues me seeing the Master actually being curious about something, being in this weird realm of non-existence. Perhaps one of the things that makes this story interesting, along with the box set theme as a whole, is that because we're in a different dimension entirely, for once the War Master doesn't possess all the cards. Again, there is that element of unpredictability, where you think, oh, the Master could be wrong here, because he's not really used to this realm and the way that it works, because physics is kind of a little bit weird here. There is something very haunting about the Shadow as a concept, very much like how the Weeping Angels are within Blink, because it's something very real and yet also very otherworldly, especially when you consider the Shadow in question could perhaps be the Master's. Once upon a time, I'd be a little bit sad about the Master's secondary role within a story, as I'd be desperate to hear more from Jacobi. And yet I find it interesting that episodes the likes of this, the Shadow Master and the Skyman, Derek Jacobi plays a more subtle role. And perhaps when he does play those more subtle roles, maybe even more darker sides to his personality come out, making a more effective performance. This incarnation of the Master now has a reputation and presence, an entire genre of work at Big Finish, which allows him to not always be centre stage, but still command the show. And when he isn't in scenes as much, you don't feel like you're missing out, especially if you've experienced the previous sets. Because there is now such a wide expanse of Derek Jacobi content out there, each box set, yes, is still special, but I think there is now that element of, oh, if this box set doesn't feature as much of the War Master, then the next one probably will. Because when the series first started, you kind of felt like each and every box set could potentially be the last because of how exciting it was that Derek Jacobi was actually doing Big Finish. Now we have much more time to experience this Master. Subsequently, I think that this episode is my personal favourite of the set. The Adventure of the Deceased Doctor is a story I felt really comfortable with. The historical setting, English gentleman, a mystery, all reminded me of good old Jagon Lightfoot, which I miss dearly. We are still in the land of fiction, and what I really like about this take on Sherlock is that Alfie Shaw has utilised intellectual property to make a murder mystery into a science fiction drama, acknowledging the effect of new adaptations within the land of fiction and how multiple of the sim character can coexist at one time, which I think is really interesting. Richard Earle returns as Watson, which is great for those who listen to the Big Finish Sherlock stories. The character carries the mystery and, much like episode 2, uses the storytelling format in an audiobook style to make the story feel personal, which I quite enjoyed, although I understand some may not enjoy that format. The other biggest selling point of this story is the fact that we get Sir Derek Jacobi as Sherlock Holmes himself, meaning the Master goes up against the very character which inspired his own creation within Doctor Who itself, which is a little bit mind-boggling. This does mean that we get to see Derek Jacobi playing a more detective role, which is different to the usual War Master stories, but adds a unique surrealness to this episode, and further contributes to the uniqueness of this set. When the Master truly appears later on, it allows for a flood of evilness all at once, which is always a delight and excellently portrayed. And for that reason, due to the fact that the Master is kind of portraying different roles throughout this set, I will probably recommend one of the other volumes as an introduction to the War Master, as throughout this series I think it only kind of works if you truly understand who the War Master is beforehand, as otherwise he's kind of just playing various different roles throughout. Due to the story style, the various murders within the mystery, and the story's rather fast pacing, I definitely recommend allotting a second listen if you have the time, allowing you to appreciate the story's scope a lot more. There's quite a few little scenes which I think can often go overlooked, especially within the early half. There's also a lot of characters and personalities to bear in mind, which, as you would expect within a murder investigation, it can often get quite complex by tying all of the various different cases and alibis together. I do think the episode perhaps ends rather quickly. I would have liked to see a few additional scenes simply to digest the impact and significance of the ending. Maybe even having a few of the scenes cut out in the early half, or even simplified, just to make the story run a little bit more smoothly, may have aided that ending conclusion. Comparing to the other War Master series, I do also like the way that this series does feel very individual. Although there is a connecting theme, each story has its own style, tailored music score, and story pacing, which certainly adds to the box set's variety. I think in the past, sets tend to follow the same style overall somewhat, so it's nice to experience something different with each individual 1 hour story. By this point within the listening experience, I did kind of wonder if all of the stories tied together. There is almost a little bit of a plot arc being present because the Master has an overall aim, but I think that perhaps come this point within the set, that plot arc becomes less important. I would have maybe liked a bit more attention delivered to that, just to kind of further the overall intention of the set, which perhaps would also make the stories a bit more concise, because by this point within the set, I was kind of unsure if I had a direction in my mind as to where the episodes were going, which I think affected my enjoyment slightly. The Master of Dorian Gray concludes this series, and it once more falls into a rather English period setting, seeing the War Master causing chaos within the life of Mr. Dorian Gray. For those Big Finish listeners who have listened to the Big Finish Dorian Gray stories, this episode must feel like an incredibly surreal ride, seeing the series essentially collide with the Doctor Who universe, meeting Dorian Gray as a series in its own right. As someone who hasn't ever listened to that Big Finish series, I think that overall the episode still works well, and that is almost certainly down to the fact that Scott Handcock has a big hand in both the War Master series, but also Dorian Gray, making this episode feel very special in design. It also makes absolute sense having David Llewellyn write this story, given his previous involvement within both series in the past. I think as the episodes within this box set go on, the stories become a little bit more grounded within a set genre. Episode 1 very much played with that idea of myths and legends, then episode 2 felt incredibly fairy tale, and then the second half of this series doesn't particularly play with the unpredictability of the land of fiction as such, but instead sees the War Master playing with the minds of fictional characters. So again, this story does feel very different in theme compared to the other War Master volumes, and I did wonder if perhaps placing the Shadow Master story, being episode 2, between episodes 3 and 4 would have been my personal preferred order to listen to this set, simply just to shake up the styles a little bit more and divide episode 3 and 4 due to their rather similar nature. Much like the John Watson story, I think there's something about the War Master meeting Dorian Gray which simply makes sense, attempting to steal his unearthly power for his own, being the fact that he basically lives forever. There are a number of cruel moments throughout this story, as the Master infiltrates a rather personal aspect of Dorian's life, seeing him fall in love with a theatre actress, and then he decides to rip them apart in a really cruel way. Due to the nature of this series, I do think that we get to see this Master being all-out evil a little bit less than usual, meaning when he is evil, it hits all the more. In true classic Doctor Who style, he does like to get quite involved, playing a character and using various disguises, which again really highlights the versatility within Derek Jacobi's performance. As the volumes within this series progress, we see Sir Jacobi take on various characters and personas within various different story settings, and I think that really sells this version of the Master for me. He's a character beyond simply being evil. He is curious, experimental, but also has things that he personally enjoys doing in his spare time. This spin-off has truly established him as a well-rounded incarnation of the Master, which is why I think I get along with him so well. Yes, he is evil, but he also has a strong passion in the likes of making wine. He has downtime and time to relax, which I think is great. But as I have already mentioned throughout this review, I do think that if you are a fan of the Dorian Gray series, you are probably going to appreciate this episode a little bit more. Overall, it is quite fast in its pace, but I did still certainly follow along with what was going on within the story, because you could really focus on that relationship dynamic between the Master and Dorian Gray, and basically watch Dorian's life slowly crumble apart around him, and he doesn't quite realise why, being framed for various things. It's quite unusual, but quite a fun story to end off the set. So in summary, for the 8th volume of the War Master spin-off series entitled Escape from Reality, I do certainly respect what this set tries to do. It feels very different in design, and all 4 stories at least try to do something different. This certainly would feel very out of place within other sets. Without a doubt, for me, the highlight of the set is the Shadow Master, being really experimental but also a very emotional story, and I love the fact that it pushes the boundaries compared to the other War Master adventures that we have seen. As the series ventures into its second half, I do question perhaps the direction of the set overall, so subsequently I don't think it is the strongest of the War Master series which have came out over the years. I think perhaps a little bit more of a direct thread to the fact that the War Master has kind of came through to this dimension by escaping a pursuit of some Daleks would have maybe really helped tie all of the stories together and give it a bit more direction, as opposed to having these episodes are so starkly different, with kind of a loose theme that ties them together, but because of the absence of that key thread, I think that perhaps at some points I did feel a little bit lost within the listening experience. So thank you very much for watching this review. I really hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for regular Big Finish reviews. I shall see you all next time.